Hi there, everybody. I apologize. I just logged in at 12:30 thinking our class was at 11:30. Obviously, all the things I'm juggling right now got in the way of good judgment, so I apologize. So what's going to happen in this video right now is I'm going to first just remind you of what's due, what's coming up. Then I'm going to go to a recorded section of the video, and then I'm going to come back at the end and review some important points. So stick around for the entire video. I'm going to share my screen now to go to our course calendar and just remind you that we have our midterm a week from today. We'll be reviewing for our midterm during our class on Tuesday next week. And then also I'll have a review session at Woodstock's Pizza at 5 p.m. on Tuesday of next week. It's in downtown Chico. So this week, turn your notes from both classes and do the peer discussion. I'll talk more about that later, and do the quiz. Remember, you really need to start preparing for this midterm. And so note that you've got a midterm review video and a study guide. Please start doing that this weekend before next week. Don't leave it all for next week. This is a really large part of your grade, and I really evaluate and value how well you were able to write out your understandings of what we've been talking about. Okay, so this video is now going to go to an older lecture covering what I didn't get to yesterday about asset market bubbles. And I'm going to come back here at the end with a little review of some ideas and just reinforce some ideas.
I'm going to do a little bit of a review, but I'm going to do it in the context of today's presentation. And so you probably noticed this as you're reading the textbook, I'm picking and choosing what to review and emphasize. And the things I'm emphasizing are things that really highlight economic concepts and analytic or ways that we try to understand intellectually how an economy works. And I'm not emphasizing his stories, but I believe his book kind of draws you in with the, I think, well-told story. And so the story of this chapter, to me, the major concept was financial panics and the reoccurrence of financial panics in American history. And I'd like to emphasize to you the reality that, you know, if history is our guide, we will have more financial panics in the future, even though they're entirely irrational. Human behavior, being that we're emotional beings, is at times irrational. And economists come at trying to understand human behavior with formulas and mathematics and statistical analysis. And what could be more opposite from a human being than that kind of rationality? And so philosophers have often talked about this tension in the human mind between our irrational side and our rational side. And economists have chosen to really ignore the irrational side of our minds, because if economists are going to do what they believe is their service, which is to provide some kind of methodical, mathematical-based reasoning for how we should conduct ourselves to create better outcomes for more people, you're not going to get that if you focus on that side. But what that does is it leaves a giant blind spot. And so I'm going to talk about that blind spot today. And what I have here, and I'll show you via our convention what I want you to write down in your notes, and it'll be relatively minimal today. Here, what I'm highlighting is a presentation that was done in Boston when I was at the American Economic Association meeting called Striving for Balance. And this was about 6 years ago. And it was the first time that someone, especially someone really prominent in the field of economics, brought up the idea that various social forces affect our behavior, and at times affect our behavior and make us more irrational. And so if you would document this, I'm just going to do a really brief diagram here that was Joseph Stiglitz's thesis for his paper. And by the way, the paper that he was presenting at this meeting was never published in the American Economic Association journal after the conference, and that's just kind of normal. When someone presents a paper, it's then published as part of a compendium or an encyclopedia, sort of a journal of everything that was discussed. And I've searched for it over the years and I've never found it published. And that's, again, an indictment of economists' inability to integrate something that is what we call heterodox. Heterodox, hetero meaning different, and dox, I don't know that Latin root or suffix, but it has to do with how you think. So it's thinking differently. And so what he put forward, and again, if you would put this in your notes, is I'm going to do a three-part system here. In our mathematical models, we've generally distilled down an individual decision to things like, and so tell me this in the chat box, what is it so far that we've said influences consumption decisions, that capital C in the demand side of our economy? What are those two variables? What are those two things that we put in parentheses that we believe have an influence upon people's consumption decisions? It's somewhat related to inflation. It's lowercase I. What was lowercase I? Yeah, interest rates. And then what's the other one? It's what you and I have to do most years in April, although this year they put it off till May. Yeah, good, taxes. So there is no doubt a relationship there that our consumption decisions are going to depend upon the interest that we have to pay. David, by the way, inflation does have an influence. So in a more complete economic model, we'd also include inflation's influence on people's consumption decisions, and taxes affect people's consumption decisions. But we're adding something else in here, and it's something that you know influences your consumption decisions, and that is your emotions. And so what Joseph Stiglitz, and really only he could get away with this, I've seen other presentations at economics conferences where someone brings up human irrationality and literally they get shouted down by the audience. When someone gave a talk that I was at, when they were talking about how people are irrational, emotional, and at times act against their own self-interest, somebody yelled out, well, what about the demand curve? That's downward sloping, meaning as prices go down, people buy more of something. And so it's as if whenever something outside of the mainstream of economics is being brought into our field, some people become really uncomfortable with it and just shout that down because they don't want to hear it. And the reason I bring that up is that Joseph Stiglitz got away with this because he's won a Nobel Prize, because he is incredibly eminent or well-respected in our field. So he wasn't shouted down, but I'm sure there were a lot of rolling eyes. I was transfixed on him because I was just amazed that finally someone's bringing this up. So what he's bringing up in a model that he created for individual decisions is the idea that you and I make decisions not only based on our own needs, but also on forces external to us. And that there's a relationship between our decisions and what other people are doing, and then what individuals do at times influence what all others do. So there's this back and forth. And that's obvious. I mean, tell me this in the chat box. So what is something that people are, say, buying a lot of right now that's influenced by other people's decisions and other things that are popular? What's something? Stocks, certainly. Patricia, perfect. Stocks. What? There's something else. There's a form of currency that people are really excited about right now. Yeah, good, Israel. Bitcoin. Bitcoin doesn't have any inherent value, but and we'll review it later, it's gone from worthless to $60,000 per Bitcoin. And then largely the reason why that's done is that the social force of us seeing other people are interested in Bitcoin are driving people to purchase more of Bitcoin. And then what was even more revolutionary here is he added that the goals, like what we direct our attention towards, and the intensity of that attention is directed also by social forces. So these are all interacting over time rather than common economic models that say that each one of us There's a phrase that some people use to make fun of economists, that we look at all humans as Homo economicus, right? So you've heard of the evolution of humankind, and there's Homo erectus and Homo habilis, if you remember that from your biology classes. People talk about Homo economicus being this human that makes all of his or her decisions based upon variables in their mind. And so we're processing rationally. What's the inflation rate? What's the interest rate? What are taxes? And then we make our decision based on those things. But of course, it's a whole lot more complex than that. But economists try to use, again, statistics and math to understand human behavior. And we don't have, there will, in my view, never exist a mathematical way of understanding the emotional intensity and the emotionality of humans' decisions. And this, as he said, this quote right here is this fundamental form of reflexivity, meaning this reactivity to other stimuli, that is social forces, is absent in mainstream economics. And so again, I emphasize that's a real indictment of our field, because, you know, psychologists, philosophers, psychiatrists, therapists, all of those people who deal with humans have to be schooled in the nature of our emotional well-being to understand why we do things the way we do. And the simple, here's a way for me to just prove this to you. Think of not yourself, because it's difficult to see these things about ourselves, but think about someone you may know that does things that are obviously against their own self-interest. Give me an example, would you, in the chat box? What do you know of someone else that they do and it leads to bad results, yet they continue to do that thing? So it goes completely against the idea humans are rational and only do things that benefit them. Think about this for a second. People who continue to do something that they know is going to harm them. Smoking tobacco. Good, Greg. Bad diets. Exactly, Matthew. I mean, both of those are salving an emotional need. And drinking a lot, same thing, right? You get a hangover when you drink. Whenever I get a hangover, I say to myself and out loud, I'm never drinking again. And yet I like to have a couple of drinks, and then it happens again. And so all of those things, you know, that Noom app, Noom, that you see advertised on TV, and they talk about how it's based on psychology. My understanding, thanks, David. My understanding is that that's an app that tries to get you emotionally aware of any time you're eating reflexively, that you're eating out of some kind of unknown drive. And it's generally because you're feeling bad and you're wanting some kind of nourishment or sweet or whatnot to lift your mood. And so Stieglitz, well, actually, let's do this. Let's review something and add something in here. So let's do the GDP formula. Remember, consumption is a function of interest rates and taxes. But I'm also going to add emotions. And so this is what Stieglitz was finally trying to say. And what he did was made a mathematical model that incorporated in people's consumption decisions what other people were consuming. So I will not only consume what I think has value, but as I watch other people find value in something, I'm also going to want to buy that thing. And that, I think, is obvious to most of us, but we've left that out of our models. And so again, here, business leaders, you know, by and large, are going to be incredibly rational about their investment decisions. And so certainly the idea that they're dependent upon interest rates and taxes, that's truism. But no doubt at times, these decisions are also driven by emotions. And then remember, we also have government spending and then the international sector of what is this? Tell me this in the chat box. What is X minus M? What do those stand for? This is how we, yeah, good, Jack. Thank you. Exports and imports. Thank you, Israel. Now, let's come back over here and let me use another way to try to explain what's taking place here. And let me make this a different color so it's more visible to you. So, tell me here, how are these two variables related? When interest rates go up, what happens to consumption rate spent? What happens to people's consumption levels? Interest rates go up, does it go up? Does consumption go up, or does consumption go down? In other words, is there a positive relationship or a negative relationship? Yeah, good, Matthew and David, but there is a what kind of relationship? Positive or negative relationship? Well, what does that mean? You're getting all this right. Yes, it's a negative relationship. So as interest rates move, consumption goes in the opposite direction. And as we know, the same as taxes. But when it comes to emotions, and here's why we don't include it. I mean, so people are happier. Yeah, at times that means they're going to consume more. But let's say people are scared. Okay, scared of what? Scared of travel because of COVID. Okay, so maybe emotion of fear around travel is going to be negative, right? But then what about consumption of, remember, toilet paper, right? Or bleach cleaning fluid, right? There's all kinds of vagaries or imprecision in understanding how emotions might affect consumption or investment. So let me come over here and just be thorough and do a negative sign here, a negative sign here, and then again, another question mark. And so economists, like everyone, want to be right. And to create a mathematical model with emotions, you might be right sometimes, but you might be wrong sometimes, so we just ignore it. But in ignoring it, we're missing a huge part of the human experience, which then means we're missing a huge part of why people do the things they do in the economic universe. And so that's what financial panics are. They're generally irrational movement of people towards some investment that eventually crashes. And so today's class is going to be about the history and the inevitability of these asset market bubbles, we call them. And so a summary of his presentation said, Professor Joseph Stiglitz, and again noting he's a Nobel Prize winner, showed how models that ignore social influences on people's choices often offer misleading conclusions, particularly regarding the effects of economic policy. Economists pride ourselves in the ability to provide predictions about how economic policies will affect economic outcomes. Well, if we're missing social influences, then we may be offering misleading conclusions. And I could spend another class talking about all of the economic forecasts that have made in the past, where people have relied solely on mathematics and a rational understanding of human behavior, and they have pushed these theories out to politicians and to voters, and it's ended up doing exactly the opposite of what we've intended to do. And this is why, rightly, economists are the butt of many jokes that, I think we're made fun of more than people who forecast the weather, because at least they have a scientific basis for forecasting the weather. We are trying to have a scientific basis for human behavior, but as I'm saying here, it's near impossible to completely understand mathematically human behavior when it involves emotions. And so it said that economists have physics envy. And that's a play on Freudian psychology of another kind of envy that I won't talk about here. But the idea of having physics envy is the idea that in physics, in the physical sciences, you can make mathematically precise calculations and predictions of what will happen in the physical world. And we try to do that with the mathematics of physics. We borrow a lot of the complicated mathematics from physics, but we, as this quote says, often come up with misleading conclusions because we are dealing with mathematics around human behavior that, again, is very, again, misleading. So here, I'd like you to write this here. This is a major part of what I'm trying to take away from this chapter, and that is the prevalence of financial panics. And so note here, when you write down these years, notice the time difference between each one, because that's really important. From 1819 to 1837. So a difference of about 20 years. And so all of these panics were about different types of investments that people got really excited about, and people rushed towards those investments and poured money into those things. So stocks in railroad companies, the purchasing of Western land, the stock of overseas trading companies, of gold, of silver, of stock market, of stocks in 1929, 2007, in the housing market. And notice that there's about a 20-year difference in the first case. Then there's between 1837 and 1873, about a 40-year difference. And then notice another 20-year difference, then less, then another about 20-year difference. And so note that it was fairly regular. Every less than 20 to 40 years, people would get overly enthusiastic about some asset that was going to solve all their problems and make them rich. But those assets eventually collapsed and people were made broke. But then people don't want to remember that. We fool ourselves. And this gets back to this idea of continually doing something that you know is going to be harmful. There's no joking about abusive relationships, right? Abusive relationships are something that we need to deal with in our own lives. But it's like an abusive relationship. You keep going back to this person or thing because you believe they are going to fulfill you, but you keep getting this negative feedback. And in the case of abusive relationships, it's obviously physical or emotional abuse. In this case, it is an asset that you think is going to make you rich, but then collapses. And then people continue to go back to that because they continue to fool themselves into thinking that this asset is going to solve their problems, or this relationship is going to solve their problems. And so the story economists tell about asset market bubbles. And so let's write that out. An asset market bubble is when a certain asset, some kind of thing that people buy that they think is going to increase in value to make them more wealthy. A bubble indicates, what always happens with a bubble? As a child, you'd always try to build the biggest. And you would, I don't know if you were like me, you would compete to see whose could last the longest. But inevitably, a bubble will pop. And in fact, in economics, all the way into the housing market crash that caused the Great Recession in 2007, 8, 9, there were economists who actually were very public about, no, that doesn't happen. Bubbles don't pop. There's no such thing as an asset market bubble. Assets are always priced perfectly because markets always work perfectly. Now, those people are laughed off the stage now. That's no longer part of mainstream economics, but it was for a long time. And what it does is it misses this historical reality, and I'll show you other examples in a second. So in Holland, in the 1600s, here's the story. There was a Turkish diplomat who was in Holland who brought as a gift to the queen a tulip bulb. And a tulip bulb is simply a seed for a tulip flower. And he brought it as a gift to the queen. And so note here in 1634, at that point in time, and I believe this is in Gilde. I believe this is in Gilde. Gilde is, or guilders, I'm just pronouncing it the way the Dutch do. That is the unit of currency they used. And notice it started off as about a Gilde each. Gilde is maybe last that it was around was maybe 25 to 50 cents. And this was very, very early. So this was pennies. It was worth just pennies. But then the value started to rise because since the Queen got this tulip, the Queen is incredibly popular in Holland, and especially it was popular then. And when it got out that she had this beautiful tulip garden, people became really excited about, you know what, I'd like to have tulips now as well. And tulips, in fact, are a famous now export from Holland. They have very, very large greenhouses where they propagate flowers and tulips and send them around the world. But what economists call this is a mania. So if you've heard that word is used in psychology to describe a mental challenge that some people have. Mania is becoming so excited, so full of energy about something that it's outside of what is rational. You may have heard of bipolar depression. Bipolar means two sides of the human mind, and bipolar depression, I've known people who've had it. You watch them cycle between being very depressed to being manic. And manic, again, is this mania, this being irrationally excited and energetic about something. And so this mania drove this tulip to be a coveted, meaning people really, really wanted this good and wanted to show off this good. And so it was something that people used to demonstrate that they were somebody of substance. And the price of this good actually increased, as you see through these years here. It increased from 1 to 60 guilders, or Gilde, so much that it was 10 times the annual income of a skilled craftsperson. And recall from our previous classes, we're talking about a time frame where the average person was incredibly poor. And so this is 10 times the annual income of someone who is very much high in the distribution of income in that society. So no doubt, when we think about it now, so a skilled craftsman in our society is going to make, I would say, $100,000, right? If you're a good plumber or an electrician. And so 10 times that in the modern age would mean $1 million. And what are we talking about? We're talking about one seed for a flower, right? So if we're translating this into modern terms, it would be as if people got so excited about a seed for a flower, they were willing to pay $1 million for it. And so no doubt, this is an example of what Joe Stiglitz was talking about, of social influences having effect on other people's choices. That is, as society sees the Queen having this tulip and propagating tulips, other people wanted to do the same. So the equivalent of $1 million was paid for a flower seed. But notice what happened at some point. A massive drop in the value of this seed. And so what's happening here? Recall what I'd asked you in last class with regard to Andrew Jackson's mistrust of speculation. That is, buying up an asset only, not to use it, right? Not to use it for its own value, but to buy an asset on borrowed money in order to simply see that asset increase in value and then sell that as a profit. He was absolutely against that, in part because that seems irrational. Somebody's time, effort, and money needs to be put into something that's materially productive that will help everyone. But in this case, if you're simply buying a tulip seed, you're only doing it in order to, one, show off that you have a coveted luxury item, and two, that you expect the value to go up so you can make more money. So note, at the top of this bubble, somebody maybe borrowed 60 Gilde the equivalent of $1 million in today's money, in order to buy that asset, expecting it to go up even further. But note it didn't. People realized at this moment, oh no, this asset is not worth what I thought it was worth. It collapses. And imagine yourself, let's say you borrowed, yes, exactly, Greg, Beanie Babies. Back in my day, in the 1980s, people got very, very excited about some doll. And Greg, I don't remember the value that it went up to, but it was a ridiculous level that people just wanted. It was a coveted, I guess, luxury item, and people tried to make money off it. And I assume it crashed at some point. Imagine you borrowing $1 million for a little doll, expecting to sell it for more than $1 million, and then the value goes down to nothing. Now you owe $1 million, and you have no asset that's worth $1 million. You're bankrupt. And that's the tale of asset market bubbles, but they keep happening. So another example of asset market bubbles have been our stock market. So here's not the most recent picture of the value of stocks in our country. I believe this is the Dow Jones Industrial Average. What this shows from 1975 through 2014 is the value of 30 different stocks that are major American industrial companies. And notice that there is an upward trend over all of these years. It really took off in the 1990s. And people at these peaks of the asset, people fool themselves into thinking this is going to go on forever. So I'm going to show you an example of people's foolish thoughts of always thinking things are going to get better. The arrow points to the peak of the asset market in the 2000s. This was known as the dot-com bubble. So this run up in stock values there, as you see going up to that peak point at 12,000. So that was a measure of the value of 30 major industrial companies. This was based on people's belief at the time that the internet was going to make everyone incredibly wealthy, and certainly it has. But there was a level of mania, of the craziness, that in the paper, I remember at the time in the newspapers, every other article, it seemed, was about the new era of the internet and how it was going to change all of our lives. And that is true. But along with that was the idea our economy and our stock market would skyrocket so much that you should just pour money into stocks right now, because now is the time with the internet where all stocks are going to go up forever. And so note these two books that were published at this time of the peak. They're predicting that the Dow Jones Industrial Average, while it was 12,000, would go up to 36,000 or 40,000. But notice what happened. It dropped thereafter. But the point I'm trying to make here, and the point, what used to be heterodox economics, what used to not be accepted and now is accepted more and more, is that people forget, oh, people were terribly wrong in 2000. But regardless, people believe, well, next time it's different. And so notice this book right here, Why It's Different This Time. Robert Zucaro wrote this right here around this peak. Notice what happened right after his book was published. What he was saying was, and notice he said that the Dow Jones would get to 30,000 in 2008. So here's 2008, and he expected it to get way up beyond where our screen is. So the theme here is people influenced by others and influenced by their own irrationality and hope for that all their dreams are going to be fulfilled by the stock market and becoming wealthy, that we forget that just 8 years ago in 2000, people were thinking the same thing and everything crashed. This right here is a graphic from a financial website that is meant to help investors understand what happens when there is a rise in a stock price or an asset price. And so note, over time, what is the value of this asset? And so they're saying the stealth phase here is when not a lot of people know about this asset. And so smart people will invest here knowing this stock will likely go up. The awareness phase comes when now more and more people start learning about this stock. And so big institutional investors, groups of people who invest retirement savings, start investing in this. But then the mania phase comes in. And that's when the general public starts taking their money and pouring it into a stock. So what are we talking about here? We're talking about GameStop, right? We're talking about AMC, the other stock that the subreddit Wall Street Bets did. They were counting on this. And so if you're somebody who's starting at the beginning here, you're going to make a lot of money so long as you sell at the right time. But generally, there's always this collapse, or what they call the blow-off phase. Now notice the words they use here. There's nothing technical or mathematic here. Enthusiasm is drawing more people to buy this asset. Greed is driving people to buy this asset. Then delusion. Delusion means you're not seeing the truth. Some people are buying this asset when it's worth a lot of money, not knowing that most people, most informed investors are thinking, I'm not quite sure about that. Notice then there's a new paradigm that, just like that book that said this time is different, people are trying to convince themselves that no way can this asset go down in value. Then they're in denial, then there's fear, then there's capitulation, then there's despair. Notice that in an otherwise rational discourse or discussion about finance, that even finance experts use psychological, emotional terms because they realize that at times with Bitcoin, with GameStop, with homes, and in our history, stocks, railroad stock, foreign stock, Western land, we've had this over and over again. But remember, we get enthusiastic, greedy, and delusional around this, and at times are in denial that this continues to happen. So here's Bitcoin. Let me call your attention, not to today, but to 2018. Notice that some people were buying it at relatively low values, yet it went up to $20,000, and then later on, it crashed. Now, why? Well, what is the value of a Bitcoin? How is a Bitcoin valuable? Any kind of currency is valuable insofar as you can use it as a currency and that it'll store value. This can happen over years, Matthew, and I'm going to show you over years here. So notice with the tulip bulb, that was over 4 or 5 years. Notice here, this is about maybe a 6-month period right here with Bitcoin. Notice here, who knows how long this will last. I'm not going to give you any advice whether to buy or sell Bitcoin because its value depends upon other people's belief of its value. And I can't predict what other people's beliefs are. Right now, the value of it is going up for a number of reasons. Let me come back to that. But notice here, I recall I was teaching this class about asset market bubbles in this time frame, and I was teaching it right about here. And somebody said, you know what, I'm thinking about buying Bitcoin. And I said, you know, go for it, but beware that there's no inherent value to this asset. And all you're doing is betting on what other people bet it's worth. And so the student didn't do it. And then we were in class around here. And he said, Price, you told me not to buy it. I said, I didn't tell you not to buy it. I said, I don't know where it's going, but watch out. It might be high now, but it's going to drop. And notice it obviously dropped. I didn't have any crystal ball. I didn't have any unique insight other than an economist who studied history that knows that this happens throughout history. And so what am I saying about this right here? There's a strong likelihood it drops again, unless we can get more and more people excited about it, which is a form of a scam, right? As long as I can get more people to buy into this idea, I can make more money. So Right now, it's going up in value because more and more banks are beginning to set up desks to allow their investors to invest in Bitcoin. Elon Musk, I believe, spent $1.5 billion to buy up Bitcoin. Elon Musk has announced that he will accept Bitcoin for payment for Teslas. So notice those Elon Musks twice in there. You know, he's the master at being a very public celebrity rock star CEO. I think a lot of this has to do with his cheerleading. But to an economist, so the chairman of the Federal Reserve was talking about Bitcoin recently in front of the Senate. We worry about this being a store of value. So this currency that I have, this dollar I have crumpled up over here, you know, this loses value over time, but it's a relatively good store of value, right? There's inflation that eats away at the value of this thing, but I'm keeping this around. It's all crumpled up in my laundry right over here because I know tomorrow I can take it. I can get myself something at the store. And while it might be a little bit more expensive with inflation, that dollar is going to still have value. Notice the gyrations here in the value of Bitcoin. And if history holds, this is going to collapse once again. One prediction I can make is that people are rushing to this right now. People rush to gold. People rush to Bitcoin, it seems, when times are looking precarious, when economic times are looking difficult. So I think when our economy starts roaring again, which it will within the next 6 months to a year, I foresee that likely, if history is our guide, that this will drop down again. And so really the value is coming from people believing other people has value, but try to use your Bitcoin, right? We're still working on ways for people to take Bitcoins and use them in the wider economy. I met a man in San Francisco a number of years ago who was in the industry of cryptocurrency, and they were working on a debit card that would come from your account with your cryptocurrency to use anywhere. Great. I mean, if we can do that and then Bitcoin can be used at every store, then maybe it really does have some value. But economists always look to, well, is it something I want to hold to contain value? And that hasn't been the history of the Bitcoin. So again, there's much more than just this. This is not just an American phenomenon. Here is, so to your question, Matthew, can it happen over just years? Notice over years. Notice here, this is both Japanese real estate prices and the Japanese stock market in the 1980s, 90s, and into the 2000s. Notice that at the same time, in early 1990, there was a run-up. Look at the stock market increasing, looks like 4 times over the course of, it looks like, maybe 7 years. So over years, yeah, it looks like 7 years where this bubble is inflating. And certainly, some people bought stocks at a relatively low level and sold them up here and got fabulously wealthy. But there are also people here who bought the stock at its highest value and it lost all of its value. The same with real estate. Notice the real estate market starts taking off in about 1986. And then it starts crashing in about 1991. So you're talking about a course of over 5 years where the Japanese real estate market inflated and then the price of real estate collapsed. Now, who cares? It's beyond just individual investors losing money. This put Japan into a recession that lasted 20 years, that they're still working to get out of. So this inflation of an asset and then the collapse of an asset eats away at so many people's wealth that they actually start consuming and investing less. So another thing we could add into that formula that I won't do, consumption is a function of interest rates, taxes, emotions, also the level of wealth. What's the value of our assets? And so imagine being a multimillionaire and then not being a multimillionaire anymore, but still having the same income. Certainly, when you were a multimillionaire, you'd be spending a lot more money. But then when your wealth is eroded, even if you're making the same amount of income each year, you will no doubt cut back on your spending because you don't feel as wealthy. You don't have that large bank account. So again, We've seen this so far now in the American stock market over history. We've seen it in Holland for tulip bulbs. We've seen it in Japan in the real estate market. We've seen it worldwide with Bitcoin in 2018, although right now it's exploding again. Now the story of the United States. Notice the top line of home prices. So the price of a home should relate to some very specific variables. So remember what economists like to do, to try to predict something based on some predictable variables. And the variables that generally increase or decrease the value of the home are threefold. What it costs to build a home, how many people need to buy the home, population, and how much it costs to borrow money to buy a home. So notice home prices that started in the 1940s after World War II. Notice this massive increase here because you get people coming home from overseas. And here, the government starts a program where or really upgrades a program where they start offering low interest loans to people. Remember the story there, that those low interest loans were only available by law to white people. Regardless, that those loans being available increased the value of homes. And then there was a slow rise of home prices, right? A very gentle slope in the increase of homes. But now look at population. So notice right here, notice population rising. So more people need a home, so that's related to this slow rise here. But then notice population, building costs, my bad. Building costs rising, and then building costs falling. So that building costs falling should cause the price of homes to go down. We're not seeing that here. The population, more and more demand for homes going up, so that should be part of this rise here. Interest rates going down should be part of this rise here, but there's no explanation, no rational explanation for why that spike in home prices took place. And then look here at this dramatic drop in home prices. That dramatic drop in home prices caused the Great Recession. That caused tons of human suffering, people to lose their homes, lose their jobs. And that perpetuated itself for a number of years. So let's look at another way of looking at these home prices. So here is zooming in to the years 1983 to 2013 on home prices. Notice that kind of, if you take from here back to here, there's a slight steady rise. But all of a sudden, there was this massive bubble, right? Huge increase in home prices. And what's happening here is many things at once. There are very low interest rates, so it's cheaper to borrow money to buy a home. But there's also a change in how we decided to fund home buying. Now, really quickly, notice how it collapsed and kind of stayed flat. I just went out and found the new data on home prices. There was up until 2013. Notice what they've done again. They've gone up tremendously here. Now, if the value of a home is increasing, so let's take a look at it here. In 2000, it was equal to 100. So this is what we call an index. This isn't the value of every home, but is an average of homes in, so let me note this, 10 large cities in blue, 20 large cities in red, and then all home value averages across the nation. And so when it's equal to 100 and it increases to 200, that means that there's been an 100% increase in home prices. Notice here, between 2000 and 2020, it looks like, at least for the top 10 cities, that there's been a 150% increase in home prices. So the question right now is, are we in another bubble? Is that going to collapse? I don't know the answer to that question. I think it's possible, because we've held interest rates down so long to try to fight COVID, that this number might collapse here and might cause a lot of suffering in our economy. So what happened? Now let's go back to the previous example of what happened with original home prices. What was it that caused this bubble and the collapse of this bubble? So there's nothing to explain it here, right? There's no explanatory variable with building costs, population, or interest rates. So here it's part of a larger story. Don't try to take this down in your notes. Just try to listen and soak this up. What used to be the case in banking was that people with money take their money and they deposit it, obviously, into a bank. And banks would take some of that money and keep it as a legal reserve. The reality is banks are required to keep, have been in the past, I should say, 10% of all our money in case any of us want to withdraw. But banks traditionally have been able to loan out the rest of it. So they keep 10% and they loan out 90%. In other words, banks are in the practice of making money. That's why you want to be a banker. That's why you want to own a bank, because you take in people's money, keep a little bit in case people want to take out some money, and then loan out the rest of somebody else's money. So in the past, they would take some of people's money, keep it, loan it out to others, and that borrower would pay that bank back. Seems pretty simple. The idea is that you need to trust this borrower. The word credit comes from the Latin credo, or belief. The bank needs to believe the borrower has good intentions and will pay that money back to them. So the bank has a responsibility to themselves to make sure that these borrowers are creditworthy and will pay that money back. But in part, because our country from the 1930s into the 1990s, both by official government policy and by bank policy, would in the beginning, not loan at all to Black people to buy homes, and especially in predominantly Black or brown neighborhoods. Banks took over that, what was called redlining. The government, as we've talked about in the past, drew maps of different areas. And I have a link to this in our module for, I believe, Unit 1. They have maps of every city in California, every large city in California. And around areas they lend to, it's blue and green, I believe. But then there are areas that are outlined in red. And those areas outlined in red are areas that are predominantly African American and Latinx. And so the reason the bank wouldn't lend to them is because they believe there were bad credit risks. And certainly if it's a poor area, you're going to have less creditworthy people. But they made a practice that everyone in that area wouldn't get a loan. And so there was a push to open up loans to more people, which is a good idea. But the way we did it had unintended consequences. Economists call this the law of unintended consequences. You try to solve a problem and you haven't thought it fully through, it might lead to even worse outcomes. And that certainly happened with people of color who bought during this time in the 2000s, bought a home that was relatively expensive on borrowed money, and then saw that bubble burst. And they lost all the value of their home, lost their home, and then ended up being bankrupt because they couldn't pay back their loans. So we called this financial modernization in the 1990s. So again, just follow along. This is going to be much more complicated than the first graphic. You have a depositor who deposits money in the bank, just like before. And the bank would keep 10% as they were required by law to do. Then they would loan money out to borrowers. And so a home loan is called a mortgage, simply the name of a loan for a home. So they'd loan money out to borrowers, but then they would take all of these multiple loans. So each one of those lines represents a loan to a borrower to buy a home. They would take those and they would package them together. So they'd take, let's say, 1,000 home loans, let's say worth $10 million for 1,000 home loans. And they would sell them to somebody. Hey, we loaned this amount of money to somebody. We'll sell you this package of loans. And why would you buy a package of loans? Because that means that you're going to be paid back over time with a certain interest rate. So this was a new thing. They were called securitized loans. They were taking a bunch of loans and making them into an investment. MBS stands for mortgage-backed securities. So an investment in a group of loans that people thought they could make money off of. Now, among these loans were loans that we call ninja loans or liar's loans. Banks would make loans to people without looking at what their income was called. It was technically called a stated income loan, meaning whatever you state your income is, we will loan to you based upon what you stated. So I could state I make $500,000 and they'll never check. And so in doing that, people would simply lie and say they made more money than they did so they could become eligible for a larger home loan so they could buy a more expensive house. The other loans, NINJA stands for no job, no income, and no assets. So imagine giving out a $250,000, $250,000 loan to somebody with no proof of income, no proof of a job, and no proof of assets or wealth. That's not a good bet. Remember before, banks had to do their due diligence to make sure their borrowers, they believed in them, right? Credo, that they had credit because they believed they're going to pay them back. Well, here banks were lending out to people upon lies and who did not have income or jobs or assets. And then outside ratings agencies, Standard & Poor, Fitch, Moody, 3 companies that have settled with the US government to pay millions of dollars, billions, 1.5 billion in one case, in fines for what they did here. These agencies would rate the packages of loans for investors. They'd say, this package of home loans is A-OK. They had a rating scale like A through F for school, but here it was AAA, AA, single A, triple B, double B, single B. That's just a grading system of how likely it was that people were going to pay their loans back. And the banks would pay them literally for looking over a package of loans up to $100,000, I've heard, for just looking at a package of loans and saying, you know what, these people are going to pay it back. Give us $100,000, we'll put our stamp of approval on it. And so note what can happen there. Ratings agencies know the bank will pay them lots of money to say these loans are great. Well, shoot, I'm going to say every package of loans are great if I can, for a few hours work, get $100,000. And so people trusted these ratings agencies, and they trusted them enough to buy those package of loans from the banks. So the banks would be able to sell those packages of loans to investors, to big institutional investors, even some school districts with their reservoir funds, some towns around the country and world with their reservoir funds would invest in these packages of loans. Retail means just individual investors. They'd buy these because they think this is a great investment. These ratings agencies say these people are going to pay back the loans. And furthermore, these packages of loans are really high interest rates. So if I own the loan, I'm going to make a whole lot more money. And so importantly here, banks get those loans off their balance sheet, right? They no longer have to rely upon that money coming in for the borrowers because now they've sold that loan to somebody else to collect the money. And so the banks then sell those loans off of their books, get more money to do this all over again. So note, if a bank can loan money, sell that loan to somebody else and get more money, and then loan that money again, and then sell that loan to somebody else, the banks are continually loaning money for people to buy homes. And so if more and more people are getting loans in this process, we call this a virtuous cycle, because this is going to continually appreciate or increase the value of that asset. But there's a problem. The problem is that those loans were given to people who would never be able to pay them off. The problem is borrowers lied and took out loans they knew they would never be able to pay off, but they assumed that the value of property would continue to go up. The banks were negligent in not really being sure that those borrowers were creditworthy. The ratings agencies, like I said, paid billions of dollars in fines because they did not do their due diligence. These loans were not going to be paid off. And so note that that whole process here of all of these things taking place led to a huge number of people being able to buy homes. And at some point up here, people were starting to realize, I remember this time, there were a few economists who were saying, this doesn't make any sense. I remember a colleague of mine and somewhat of a friend gave a talk at a Chico conference about real estate right up here. And he said in front of hundreds of people, I see real estate prices continuing to go up. I don't see any problem. And you could write down questions. And so I wrote down an anonymous question so he wouldn't know it was me. And I said, how can this be true if these loans are going to people who aren't creditworthy? Isn't this market going to collapse? And he said, no, absolutely not. No, this market's going to continue to go up. So this colleague and friend of mine is incredibly intelligent. We just forgot the reality that in the past, this has happened again and again. We fool ourselves into thinking this time it's different. Remember that title of that book, and the market collapsed. So the question is this another instance like it was before? And will we have another collapse that then will cause more people to lose their homes and cause another recession? I think it's possible, although the nice thing here, if you look at the difference here, notice this very rapid increase in prices and the rapid descent. At least now the trajectory or the movement of prices is slow and steady, so it seems less like one of those asset market bubbles. So right now, give yourself a pat on the back. You've just gone through in enormous detail what happened in 2007 and 8. Many people still don't understand what happened. All of those details that I put into that graphic is an explanation. Other people blame the government for allowing this to happen. I would also say that's true. But remember what the government was trying to do. It was trying to come up with a way to let more people buy a home to make up for the problems in racism that existed for 60, 70 some odd years in our country around home loans. So we need to think of a smarter way to do it in the future. But this whole class has been about speculation. People speculated on Japanese, that is, buy something, just betting the price will go up in hopes of selling it to somebody else. Japanese real estate, Japanese stocks, American stocks, in two instances in the recent history and once in the 1920s. All those instances in the beginning of this lecture around the financial panics throughout the 1800s. Bitcoin in 2018 and maybe again now. Tulips in the 60s.
And their role throughout history, throughout time. What I want to review, so again, for our notes, remember what our convention is for completing our notes, and that is writing down things that have a red bullet number or letter. So, fractional reserve banking. The point in part about reviewing the market crash in 2008 is to review the reality that banks are incredibly important to capitalism. Banks have this ability to create money. And as we've talked about in the past, money is like blood, right? As infants, if our body was to grow, we needed to produce more and more nutrient-rich blood to grow and thrive as a human being. For an economy, which is a complex networked system, just like the complex networked system that our body is of cells, this complex network system needs its own blood flow of nutrients, and that blood flow is money. And money can be created by the Federal Reserve, and they can lend it out to banks and to investors to try to prop up our economy. But banks also by themselves create money. Banks do this. So add this to your notes. As we talked about at the end of the lecture there, banks only have to keep a reserve requirement. And reserve requirements for our country right now are 10%. So banks have to keep a 10% reserve requirement. So you deposit money, banks only have to keep 10%. Now with the remaining 90%, the remaining 90% can be loaned to other people, like I said in that diagram. So this money, while it's still yours, right? This is depositors' money. Banks are liable for it. If you go in to ask for all of your money out, your bank has to provide it to you. And that's why they're required to have a 10% reserve, because not every customer at once in normal economic times is going to demand all of their money back. And so this 90% remaining, so 10% is there to cover anybody who wants to take their money out. This 90% remaining can be loaned out to other people. And when this money is loaned out to other people, this is creating new money. This is new money. Banks have this incredible ability to create money by issuing a loan. And that loan, that amount of cash, is money that other people have deposited. If you don't have a banking system that enables this flow of deposits to become loans and to become new money for other people, you don't have that growing blood flow to create a thriving economy. And so banks have us in a bind. As I talked about, the banks were partially responsible for the crash in 2008, but we had to bail them out, because if you don't have a banking system, you don't have a capitalist system of creating more money and creating more financial capital. And remember, financial capital is money that's used for investment. So if this money is loaned out to a bank, this new money is financial capital to a business, and they can take that financial capital and then buy physical capital. Remember, capital K, that tools, equipment, technology to make other things. And so when they are bad actors and do something that causes a bank to collapse, we can't let the entire system collapse, or else our entire economy will collapse with it. Now, I also want to review the role that we now have with the federal government and the Federal Reserve, and a little history with it. So let's review this. Remember our demand side formula. GDP is equal to, so take a second, see if you can remember this. It's something you're going to need to know for our midterm. What are all the components there? What are the capital letters? And then what's in parentheses? Take a second and write that out. Try to remember so on your own. So recall that it's consumption spending, your and my spending, which is a function of interest rates. If interest rates go up, we tend to take out fewer loans, and so consumption goes down. The opposite is also true. If interest rates go down, people tend to take out more loans and then buy a new car or buy a new home or buy some appliances or furniture for that new home. Remember that taxes are the same way. They're also negatively related to consumption. That is that as taxes go up, we have less money available for other things. And so one of those other things is to spend on consumption. Businesses are no different. They react to interest rates in the same way. And we have government spending, exports minus imports. Now, the role of the federal government as we see it now is, in bad economic times, to raise government spending or lower taxes. And in doing so, recall this from last class, that these tools, lowering personal taxes, lowering business taxes, increasing or decreasing government spending, this is what we call fiscal policy. And remember, this is Congress and the president. When we are in good or bad times, the Federal Reserve jumps in. So in bad times, they'll lower interest rates. And in so doing, raise investment spending, raise consumption spending. And here, these tools are managed by the Federal Reserve Bank, and this we call monetary policy. Now, your peer discussion is centered around the reality that the central bank, or Federal Reserve, is using its control over the money supply to loan money out to banks and investors to try to stimulate the economy. So when we fall into a recession, and note right now we're doing the opposite. We are raising interest rates. We are soaking money back up. That is the Federal Reserve. So interest rates are going up to slow our economy down because we're experiencing high inflation and they're wanting to bring demand down. But when they want to stimulate the economy, they will loan money out. And during COVID and the massive recession there, they were loaning money out to banks and investors at 0%. Let's write this down. Banks and investors had access to 0% loans. And what the hope was is that banks and investors would then take that money and then give it to businesses who would then invest in themselves. And investing in themselves will hopefully lead to businesses buying more capital. So investment then leads to, higher investment then leads to, and I'm going to do here a double-lined arrow, meaning an equal sign and then this greater than. So this arrow going in this direction, meaning that what that's doing is that's causing us to then hopefully buy more capital. Remember, that's abbreviated as K, more tools, equipment, technology, that's stimulating the supply side. And so the hope is that by giving money to these private parties, banks and investors, they're going to do the right thing, lend it out to other businesses at low interest rates, have them invest in themselves, have them buy more capital, make more things, and then you're stimulating our economy. But it's a little bit indirect. And so in fact, during COVID, the Federal Reserve created let's put a dollar sign, $5 trillion in new money. And these were loans, and that's right, during COVID. These were loans to banks and investors at 0% and buying up assets from them. So what it does is it prints money and it buys up assets from banks and investors to give them money that hopefully they'll lend out. Now, the question is this what we should be doing in hard economic times? Should we be giving those that already have money, investors and banks, money to hopefully stimulate our economy? Because they could take that 0% loan and just use it to pay off their debts, or use it to invest, frankly, overseas, or use it to invest in the stock market. That's why during COVID, the stock market was booming, because banks and investors could get 0% loans. And if you get free money, why not invest it in the stock market? Why not take that money and give it directly to people? So I'm going to change the screen I'm sharing here and go to our peer discussion. So remember, the goal of the Federal Reserve, as we talked about last class, is to try to keep inflation under control on or about 2% and keep unemployment low, less than 5%. And as I say here, Federal Reserve Bank created $5 trillion in new money to try to stimulate the demand side, stimulate consumption by consumers and businesses. What do you think about the possibility that we could do other things with this money? Rather than leaving it up to banks and investors, why not have some vision about what to do with this money that would create real solutions, say, for our future? Like we directed those monies toward wind and solar projects nationwide to eliminate pollution and reliance on foreign oil, or the dictates of the market like we have right now with oil prices going up again. because countries that produce oil have decided to produce less. What about taking that money and giving it to completely forgivable college loans for students? Let's say if you graduate with a certain GPA, you really worked hard, you get your loans paid for. What about loans for poor and people of color who, from the 1930s on into really the 1990s, and we'll talk more about this in the future, were barred from getting federally financed, subsidized loans because of their race. This is a reality. We'll talk more about this later. Maybe provide home loans to the poor so they can build up wealth, and home loans to people of color who were barred from these loans starting in the 1930s by US government policy. I'll give you the facts on that in a later class. What about forgivable loans for new college grads to the poor or middle class to start a business, or to hire those who have a business who are out of work? And so I'm asking you to think big. What kind of ideas? Do you like these ideas? Comment on this. Why not take that money rather than saying, okay, here, banks and investors, go do something we hope good with this. Instead, no, we're going to direct it towards something we know is good. And so, as I say in number 2, the Fed uses money to buy investments from banks and investors who in turn can use that money to help others, but it trickles down from the top. Banks and investors are holding on to lots of money, and they're looking with that money, okay, where can I invest that to earn the highest rate of return? Well, not all of that money is going to trickle down to every consumer, right? They might choose investments in just one area of the country and leave other areas of the country without this money. And so that money doesn't come from the top and trickle down to those at the bottom. So do you see any unfairness in this $5 trillion created during COVID that could have gone directly, rather than banks and investors, but to people in need? And so, like I say up above, think big. What else? What else could we do with this money? We had $5 trillion. You know, that's nearly a quarter of the size of our yearly economy. What could we have done? But now, lastly, I add that really, should we give the Federal Reserve this kind of control? Because fiscal policy, as we were talking about earlier, government spending is controlled by Congress and the president. Right? It says there right there in Article 1 that the House shall appropriate money to be spent by the government. And I'm not getting the wording exactly right, but the House decides where to spend money. Well, the Constitution, as we've talked about, was created far before we realized that a central bank is an important part in our economy. But should we at times give this authority to the Federal Reserve, or should it be in the hands of those we had elected, right? We are in supposedly a republic, right? We vote, we are in a democracy. That's not really the perfect word for it. The democracy is really where you vote directly for everything. We're in a republic where we vote for representatives who then vote for us. So should we give this power to an unelected body, right? The Federal Reserve is appointed by the president, confirmed by the Senate. They could decide, shoot, if we gave them this authority, maybe they could decide to give it to their friends. Now, hopefully we'd come up with rules around that. But I'm asking, you know, given the fact that we've learned about the role of the central bank and our evolving understanding about the need for a central bank and the uses of a central bank, and the fact that it's lessened the wild flows of the business cycle, the very small ups and downs, because it puts guardrails on our growth, should we maybe evolve in our understanding and think that, you know, if it does have this power to create this lifeblood for an economy, let's take that lifeblood and make sure it's going to those in need, rather than maybe trickling down. But again, address the fact that, well, is that really the role of an unelected body in a democracy? So I want to go back and just review a couple of things. They were in this week's chapter around transportation. And I believe a little bit last week. We had a national road built by the federal government in 1818. And if you remember when we reviewed the Constitution, and we were looking at the Constitution in terms of those 4 other reasons why another economist believe we grow, Bernstein's formula of fast and efficient transportation and communications. Remember, a capital market for people with money, provided to those who need money. Remember my question, can you buy a banana at a capital market? No, it's not that kind of a market. Where people with money are married with those with the need for money, not married literally, but metaphorically. Scientific rationalism, and let's see, fast and efficient communication, well-functioning capital markets, scientific rationalism, and oh boy, well, I'm forgetting the fourth. Always with four things, you forget four things. Good thing I'm not asking you to recite those on the test, or else you could say something to me about remembering all four. So one of those, the first one I remembered, is the apt one, fast and efficient communications. And in the Constitution, it says we'll have postal roads, so roads to deliver the mail. Nowhere in there was there anything that said anything about federal roads. So there was, as we've talked about, having to do with the Federal Reserve or railroads or government aid for canals, there was a debate about whether this was constitutional. It never says national road in our Constitution. Now, on the economic side, let's make an argument for government involvement here. So let's now remember the supply side formula. Again, something you're going to need to remember and know for our test. Remember, the supply side is three things: the amount of land or natural resources, labor, human resources, K for capital, because we already use C for consumption, and how productively we use those things. And remember, productivity is positively related with these items than the supply side. So supply side equals this: we can make more goods and services if we have more natural resources, more labor resources, more capital resources. And then if we more productively use our labor, then that increases the amount we can use. If people are working more efficiently, we can produce more stuff. If our natural resources are used more efficiently, like using more of the sun's energy, then that increases the amount we can make. If the tools and equipment and tech could get better over time, become more efficient, that increases the amount of stuff we can make. Well, what does a national road do? What does infrastructure do but create faster transportation? Faster transportation always equals greater productivity. If I'm able to get to point A to point B, or get my product from point A to point B quicker, that means I'm being more efficient. That means I'm increasing productivity. And who else is going to build a national road? Right? What private entity is going to build an interstate highway? Right? There's no profit unless you're able to charge a toll. And then a toll, you're not able to equally use that resource to increase everybody's productivity. So there's a real strong economic argument that you need a national government to provide some of the services that go nationwide that no private business would build on its own for the profit motive, but will be available to everybody. We call these public goods, something that's available to everybody and something that not only helps the person who's using it, but helps an entire society. And when an individual uses it, it actually helps all society. Somebody getting goods to market doesn't just help that person, it helps the entire economy getting things from one place to another efficiently. So taking this into account, this reality of the supply side, the federal government does have this huge role that just about everyone agrees with. Even the most conservative politician or economist is going to say, yeah, federal roads are something that we need the federal government to have involvement. Excuse me. So I'm just going to move that up there, but then continue. So I just want you to repeat this. We did something similar to this in the last class of the class before, but this was again the time before McCulloch versus Maryland, or Maryland versus McCulloch, which was the time where we ruled, or the Supreme Court ruled, that part in the Constitution that Congress can do everything that is necessary and proper to the running of a country was part of the implied powers, right? And implied means it's not stated explicitly, it's not written out explicitly, but in the text of the Constitution, it's there. Remember that idea of strict constructionalism, right? It's not exactly in there. Well, even a strict constructionalist will say these days, not then, these days they say, well, no, we all agree by the precedent set by the Supreme Court in 1819 with Maryland versus McCulloch, that indeed there is some elasticity, some stretchiness, some ability to widen the interpretation of the Constitution rather than just look at exactly what the letter of the Constitution says. So this is also known as the necessary and proper clause and the elastic clause. So this debate really went by the wayside. But for your notes here, President Jackson vetoed this bill for later on in 1830 for more national roads. He did not see that role for the government. He did not see, even though he was a populist, he didn't quite see the popular demand yet for that as a politician, nor did he understand that you wouldn't get the kind of growth that we had as we grew our nation out west from having a national road system. All right, moving on. I'll delete that just for the sake of keeping things clean. Last thing. We also see in this time frame between 1815 and 1860 this huge increase in productivity. Huge increase. So think about the supply side really growing. More people are being hired. More natural resources are being bought. More capital is being purchased by businesses as we are growing as a nation, but we're also using those much, much more productively. So our land resources, we're able to use those better. Our labor resources, people are getting more intelligent, more work savvy, getting greater skills. Our capital is increasing in its usefulness, in its ability to give us more efficient ways of life. And that's really causing the growth. What we see over history is more land, labor, and capital just give us about a third of our growth. But increasing the productivity, the efficiency with which we use those three things, that creates 2/3 of our growth. Now, there's another side to this. So I'm just reiterating the importance of productivity and more land, labor, capital on the supply side. The other reality is that this allows producers to have lower costs, right? If you're more efficient, your costs have gone down. So if your efficiency or your productivity is increased by 4%, now note that's an average for everyone over that time frame. But let's say you're one business and you're more efficient by 4%. That means essentially your costs have gone down, all other things equal, 4%. And if your costs have gone down and you're bringing in just as much revenue, then you're making more profit, right? Let me just write out a quick and dirty formula here. For total revenue for any business minus its total costs equals its profit or loss. And so if we assume, and so let's write something like, we're assuming this is the same. Okay, we're assuming revenue is the same. There's nothing here when you increase efficiency that would necessarily change revenue. Although I would say this, that if productivity is increasing and there is more supply side, there is more things being made, that means people are getting new jobs, getting wage increases. People are buying natural resources from some private party who are then going to go out and buy things from businesses. So maybe total revenue could be increasing because of this, but let's just hold that constant. But if your productivity and your efficiency is increasing and your costs are going down, if your revenue is the same and your costs are going down, that means this side, your profit here, not losses, your profits are increasing. So with higher productivity, that means you can keep your prices the same. You could just keep all of that in profits, but you're likely going to want to increase your workers' wages, right? If your workers are working that much more efficiently, why not do this? Why not say, okay, we'll increase our profits by 2%, but then let's reward our workers. The workers can raises of 2%. Notice the win-win-win here. Really 4 wins. The company gets more profit. The workers get a raise. The economy as a whole is going to grow because of the higher productivity. And then the workers getting a raise, think back to the consumption side, are then going to increase their consumption spending. And this starts then what we call a virtuous cycle of more demand and leading to more supply leading to more demand. And that is the growth cycle of a well-functioning economy. All right, again, sorry about not making it today. I'm going to post this video just as soon as I can, and we'll see you all next week.